It was just after 10 o'clock on a warm Saturday morning when Thomas Reed adjusted the brim of his old ball cap, catching his own reflection in the rearview mirror. The man staring back wasn't the polished CEO of a multi-million-dollar retail company. Gone were the tailored suits, the confident handshakes in boardrooms, the glint of cufflinks under bright city lights. Today, Thomas looked like any other man you'd see in a store parking lot, hoodie jeans and a weathered canvas bag slung over one shoulder. Ordinary on purpose. That was the point. He took a slow breath, the kind that settles in your chest when you know you're about to do something uncomfortable but necessary. Rumors had been trickling and small complaints about poor customer service, about staff treating certain shoppers with less care than others. They came in quiet, barely noticeable at first. But Thomas had built his business on something bigger than products and profit. He built it on the belief that every customer mattered, no matter their background or appearance. The store he was visiting sat just outside Dallas, tucked into a busy suburban shopping plaza. It wasn't the biggest or the busiest of his locations, but it held meaning. It was the first one he ever opened outside his home state, a risk that had paid off. He hadn't stepped inside it in years. As he stepped out of his car, the Texas sun glinted off rows of windshields, warming the pavement beneath his sneakers. The storefront stood ahead, clean and proud, the logo he had once sketched on a napkin now emblazoned in bold letters above the glass doors. For a moment, a swell of pride rose in his chest, but pride gave way to something else, something more urgent. He wasn't walking in as the boss today. No one would greet him with a handshake or rush to tidy up. That was the whole point. He needed to see his company, not through the eyes of a CEO, but through the eyes of a customer, an everyday black man walking into a store. What he didn't know yet was that this quiet visit would shake him, that the values he believed were still etched into the walls of his business might not be holding as strong as he thought, and that sometimes the hardest truths to face are the ones that come from within. The automatic doors parted with a soft whisper as Thomas stepped into the store. A burst of cool air swept over him, carrying with it the familiar scent of polished floors and freshly unpacked merchandise. All around him, life moved with the quiet rhythm of a Saturday morning rush. Parents guided children through aisles of toys, carts clattered over tiled floors, and cash registers beeped in steady succession. On the surface, everything seemed to hum with purpose and order. But Thomas wasn't here to glance over the surface. He was here to feel the pulse of the place. He paused by a bright display of kitchen appliances mixers in soft pastels and coffee makers in chrome. Nearby, a young woman in a striped company jacket smiled as she spoke with a customer, pointing out product features with a gentle, knowledgeable tone. A few feet away, a stock clerk shifted boxes with quiet efficiency, his face unreadable as he went about his task. At the far end of the store, near electronics, a young man leaned against the counter, his head bowed over a phone, thumbing through whatever held his attention. Thomas watched him for a moment, then slowly made his way in that direction. He picked up a pair of wireless headphones from a nearby shelf, turning them over in his hands. It was a simple test, nothing confrontational, just an ordinary shopper curious about a product. He lingered, giving the employee space and time to notice him. But nothing came. No glance, no greeting, not even a nod of recognition. The young man stayed fixed to his phone as if Thomas wasn't even there. Maybe he's just busy, Thomas thought. Maybe he didn't see me. He gave it another minute, then another. Still no acknowledgement. He moved on, weaving through the aisles with the casual pace of a weekend browser, though his eyes were keenly observant. He stopped near the home goods section where he saw an elderly white woman looking around with confusion. Before he could consider stepping in another employee, a young man with a bright smile approached her quickly. "Ma'am, can I help you find something?" he asked with kindness. Her face softened with relief. The two of them talked easily, laughing gently as they looked through a row of baking pans. The contrast was stark. Thomas turned back toward the electronics counter, his expression neutral, but his chest tightening. He wanted to give the young man one more chance. He picked up a box set of Bluetooth speakers and placed them on the counter in front of him, deliberately gently. This time the employee looked up. "Can I help you?" he asked flatly, his tone more obligation than welcome. Thomas offered a patient smile. "Yeah, I was wondering if these are good for outdoor use." The young man barely looked at the box. He gave it a glance, shrugged, and muttered, "I don't know." "Probably. Could you maybe check?" Thomas asked, still keeping his voice even. "I want to be sure before I buy them." The employee let out a long sigh as though Thomas had asked him to move a mountain. He grabbed the box, flipped it over lazily, and scanned the back. "Says here they're weatherproof," he mumbled, handing it back without looking up. Thomas felt the sting of it, not just the lack of interest, but the complete absence of care. Still, he stayed calm. "Okay, do you know if they're compatible with most devices?" That pushed the young man's patience over the edge. He rolled his eyes. "Look, man, all the details are right there on the box. You can read it yourself. Or pick something else. Doesn't matter to me." The silence that followed was heavy, full of things unsaid. Somewhere nearby, a baby giggled. Music played softly over the store's speakers. But at that counter, it was just the two of them, and something colder than disinterest lingered in the air. Thomas looked around. Two aisles over, a white couple laughed with a staff member as they tested phone cases. The older woman from earlier was now being helped to her car by the same young man. People were being treated with warmth, with dignity. He turned back toward the employee. "You seem busy," he said quietly, not accusing, just observing. "Is there someone else who might be able to help me?" The young man gave a crooked smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "I don't think anyone's free right now," he said. "Just figure it out, all right." Then, without waiting for a reply, he turned away and walked off, phone in hand, disappearing toward the back of the store. Thomas stood there for a long moment, the box speakers still in his hands. His heart beat a little harder now, though not from anger, at least not the loud kind. This wasn't just poor customer service. This was something deeper, something quieter. A kind of dismissal that came not from being busy or tired, but from seeing someone and deciding they weren't worth your time. He returned the box to the shelf and walked away slowly, his mind racing. It could have been an isolated encounter, he told himself. A bad attitude, a bad day. But that quiet doubt, the one that had been whispering in the back of his mind since those first complaints came in, grew louder. If this was how an employee treated someone they believed was just a regular black customer, how many others had been met with that same indifference? How many people had left this store feeling unseen, unwelcomed? And how long had it been happening without anyone noticing? Thomas didn't have the answers yet. But he knew one thing: he wasn't leaving. Not yet. Thomas wandered slowly toward the clothing section, needing a moment to gather himself. He wasn't angry, at least not outwardly. But something about the young man's indifference stuck to him like dust that wouldn't brush off. It wasn't just the words or the attitude. It was the way he'd been dismissed entirely, as if he didn't matter. As if in that employee's eyes, he wasn't a man worth helping. At a folded shirt display, a young Latina employee was organizing stacks of polos by color. She looked up the moment Thomas came near. "Good morning," she said kindly. "Let me know if you need help finding a size." Her smile was gentle. Her tone didn't feel forced. "Thanks," Thomas replied, grateful for even a small reminder that not everyone had forgotten what good service looked like. He lingered, pretending to browse. She moved on shortly after to help an elderly gentleman a few feet away. The man was holding up a dress shirt, clearly unsure of what size he needed. The employee stepped in with ease, checked the tag, asked what size he normally wore, and even offered a matching tie she thought would suit him. The older man chuckled, grateful for the help. It was a simple moment, but it warmed something in Thomas's chest. This, he thought, this is what we're supposed to be about. And yet the earlier encounter still pressed on him like a bruise you can't stop noticing. He drifted into the home goods section, his footsteps quiet, his eyes scanning without focus. Two young employees, barely out of their teens, stood near a shelf of cookware, half-heartedly adjusting items and chatting under their breath. They didn't notice Thomas approaching. "See that guy over there," one of them muttered, tilting his head ever so slightly in Thomas's direction. "Bet he's just here to browse. People like him don't ever buy anything big." Thomas's heart slowed. He turned his head slightly, pretending to study a set of stainless steel pots, while the blood drained from his face. The other employee chuckled. "Yeah, I saw him earlier. Doesn't look like he's got the dash for this kind of stuff. Probably just wasting time." The words hit harder than expected. Not shouted, not meant for him to hear, but casually tossed between coworkers like harmless chatter words spoken in a tone so effortless, it made them all the more cutting. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know they were talking about the man who signed their paychecks. To them, he was just another black man in a hoodie wandering the aisles, not worth taking seriously. He kept his eyes on the shelf, jaw tightening. A set of ceramic baking dishes blurred in front of him. He wanted to say something. Part of him ached to turn around and confront them. But he didn't, not yet, because this moment wasn't about him. It was about the people who were not CEOs, who didn't have the power to call a meeting or implement change. The ones who walked into stores just like this one and left feeling humiliated or overlooked or invisible, who went home with nothing more than a quiet ache in their chest and a question they didn't want to ask out loud. Did I deserve that? Thomas turned away, walking calmly toward the front of the store. His mind was working now, not just over what he'd heard, but what it meant. If this kind of talk happened in open aisles during regular business hours, how deep did it run when no one was listening? At the checkout line, a middle-aged black woman named Denise was working the register. Her name tag was polished, her demeanor warm and steady. Thomas watched her help the people in front of him one by one, always with a smile. When it was his turn, she looked up and greeted him the same way. "Did you find everything okay today?" "Not exactly," Thomas said quietly, "but I think I'll hold off for now." She didn't press. Her smile dimmed a little, but she nodded with understanding. "Well, if you need anything, just let us know," she said. "We're here to help." There was something genuine in her voice, no script, no force, just kindness. And for a moment it soothed him. Not everyone in this store had forgotten how to treat people, but that too was part of the problem. How could one person shine while others so easily darkened the experience? How had this kind of inconsistency crept into a place built on care and respect? As he stepped back into the heat of the Texas afternoon, the sunlight didn't feel as warm as it had before. Thomas stood by his car, hands on his hips, staring at the building that bore his company's name. He had imagined this visit would bring clarity, maybe a few rough edges, but nothing he couldn't smooth out with a follow-up call or a few coaching sessions. But this was something else entirely. It wasn't just about one rude employee. It wasn't even about two careless boys whispering prejudice in a cookware aisle. It was about culture. The quiet kind, the kind that festers when no one's paying attention, the kind that tells certain employees it's okay to decide who's worth their time and who isn't just by the way they look. Thomas felt that truth settle in his chest like a stone, and he knew without question he couldn't leave things as they were. Thomas sat behind the wheel of his car, but he didn't start it. The late afternoon heat pressed against the windows, blurring the edges of the plaza outside. The air conditioning inside the car hummed quietly, but it did little to ease the heaviness in his chest. He stared through the windshield at the storefront, his store, and tried to make sense of what he'd just seen. It didn't feel real. The place he'd once walked through with pride shaking hands and thanking staff now felt unfamiliar. Not because the layout had changed, but because the heart of it had. He gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. The words he overheard in the home goods section still echoed in his head. People like him never buy anything big. The way they said it so casually, so sure of themselves, made it clear this wasn't a one-time slip. It was part of something deeper, something that had been allowed to grow unnoticed. And that truth hurt more than Thomas expected. He thought back to the early years when it was just one store and a dream. Back then, he'd interviewed every new hire himself. He'd trained managers by example, showing them what it meant to treat every person who walked through the doors like family, not just the ones who looked like they had money or who dressed a certain way. Everyone. He'd built this company with a sense of purpose, offering not just good products, but a good experience, one rooted in dignity. But growth changes things. One store becomes then 10, then more. You start trusting others to carry the torch. You delegate because you have to. And somewhere in that expansion, little cracks begin to form, quiet hairline fractures that don't show up on a balance sheet. Thomas leaned back in his seat and exhaled slowly. Maybe he'd grown too distant. Maybe he'd relied too heavily on numbers, profit margins, sales reports, customer retention rates, when the real problem couldn't be measured that easily. It was in the tone of an employee's voice, in the glance that never came, in the tired assumptions made by people who never expected to be overheard. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small notebook. He always kept one close. Inside, he began to scribble a few lines, not just notes, but truths that had become impossible to ignore. This isn't about one store, it's about every store. It's about every person who walks in and every employee they meet. It's about the culture I thought we had, but clearly need to rebuild. The pen paused mid-sentence as another thought surfaced, uninvited but necessary. Have I failed them? Not just the customers, but the employees too. Had he failed to give them the training, the guidance, the daily reminders of what this company was supposed to stand for? Had he allowed managers to become complacent, to overlook harmful behavior, simply because it didn't cause a scene? The thought was sobering. He thought of Denise, the cashier with the warm smile and steady hands. She'd done everything right without knowing who he was. She'd shown grace and professionalism in a way that reminded him of the company's roots. People like her still carried the heart of what he'd built, but her light was being overshadowed by the shadows growing around her. And that wasn't fair. Thomas closed the notebook gently, his mind no longer clouded, but clear with resolve. If the foundation had cracked, it was his responsibility to fix it, not by issuing memos from a distant office, but by stepping back into the spaces where his values were meant to live and breathe. This wasn't about damage control. It wasn't about customer reviews or public perception. It was personal, because if he let this slide, if he walked away and told himself it was just one bad store, he'd be giving permission for it to happen again, and again, and again. No, that wasn't an option. Thomas looked up at the building one last time before opening the door and stepping back out into the Texas heat. The air hit him like a wave, but he didn't flinch. He walked with quiet determination back toward the entrance, past the familiar logo, past the sliding doors, and back into the world he had built. He wasn't going in as a mystery shopper anymore. He was going in as a man with a mission, ready to face what needed facing, and finally ask the questions he'd been avoiding. And the first question was simple: who's in charge here right now? Thomas stepped through the doors once more, his stride steady, his purpose clear. The cool air of the store greeted him again, but this time it didn't soothe him. He wasn't here to shop or observe anymore. He was here to speak, to make something right. At the customer service desk near the front, a young associate looked up from her screen. "Excuse me," Thomas said gently. "Is the store manager available? I'd like to speak with him." "Sure," she replied, polite but a bit cautious. "I'll page him." Minutes passed. Then from the back emerged a man in his late 40s, tall with graying hair and a crisp button-down tucked neatly into his slacks. His name tag read Brian. His posture was confident, practiced just enough to suggest he had been in this role a long time. "Hi there," Brian said with a professional smile. "How can I help you today?" Thomas extended his hand. "My name is Thomas Reed." The moment Brian heard the name, something shifted. His eyes widened just slightly, a flicker of realization crossing his face. He took the handshake, but now with a touch more stiffness. "I'm the owner of this store," Thomas said, his voice calm but firm. and of the company. Brian's mouth opened, then closed again, searching for the right words. Mr. Reed, I, I didn't realize you were coming. We would have, Thomas held up a hand gently. That's the point. You weren't supposed to know. I came here as a regular customer. I wanted to see the store the way anyone else would. Brian's face reddened slightly, his smile fading into something more neutral. I'm sorry to hear that, he said quietly. Did something happen? Thomas nodded, yes. A few things. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. His words carried weight simply because they came from a place of disappointment. He described what had taken place, the employee in electronics who dismissed him, the cruel assumptions whispered in the home goods aisle, and the difference in how some customers were treated with care while others were met with cold indifference. I watched a white couple get personal assistance. I watched an older woman get help by a smiling young man. But when I asked a question about Bluetooth speakers, I was brushed off like I didn't matter. Then I heard two employees refer to me, without knowing who I was, as someone who doesn't have the money to buy anything big. He paused, letting the words settle. That's not just unprofessional. That's harmful. Brian looked like he wanted to disappear. I wasn't aware these issues were happening here, he said carefully. I try to make sure the team upholds the values you've set. I believe you, Thomas replied, his voice steady. But something is slipping through the cracks. And if it's happening here, it might be happening elsewhere too. That's on all of us, including me. The store manager nodded slowly. So, what would you like to do? Thomas took a breath. I'd like you to gather the staff, right now, in the break room. Within 10 minutes, a mix of employees filed in, some in aprons, some still holding clipboards or name badges, faces etched with confusion and curiosity. The young man from electronics was among them, leaning against the wall, arms crossed. The two boys from the home goods aisle stood near the back, eyes shifting nervously. Denise, the kind cashier, entered last, her expression soft and calm. Thomas stood in front of them, not with a lectern or a clipboard, but just as a man, a leader who had come to see the truth. Good afternoon, he began. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Thomas Reed. I'm the founder and CEO of this company. A hush fell over the room. A few people stiffened. Others lowered their eyes. Earlier today, I walked into this store as a regular customer. No fanfare, no name tag, just me in a hoodie and jeans. He scanned the room slowly, meeting eyes where he could, and what I saw was troubling. He paused, then continued. Some of you, like Denise, showed warmth and professionalism even when you didn't know who I was. That means everything to me. But others, his gaze landed briefly on the electronics employee who now looked pale. Others didn't meet even the basic standard of respect. He turned toward the boys in the back. I heard things said about me, about who I am and what I can afford based on nothing more than the way I looked. The air in the room was heavy now, the kind that sits in your chest. I'm not here to embarrass anyone, Thomas said gently. That's not why I came back. I'm here because I built this company on the belief that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity. And today that belief was tested. He looked around, his voice quiet but clear. This isn't just about one bad moment. It's about a culture. And if I'm being honest, I think I let go of the reins in some places. That's on me. But starting today, that changes. Some employees looked down. Others, like Denise, nodded slowly. I'm not asking for perfection, Thomas added, but I am asking for awareness, for care, for accountability. He let the silence hang for a beat longer. And in that stillness, a shift began. They were no longer just staff in a meeting. They were part of something being reclaimed, something they hadn't realized was slipping away. Thomas didn't scold. He didn't lecture. He just told the truth with the kind of quiet strength that comes from knowing what matters and the willingness to fix what's broken. And as he looked into the faces of those who served under his name, he saw something he hadn't seen earlier that day. He saw listening, and that he hoped was the beginning. The room was silent as Thomas let his final words settle. Some employees stood still with wide eyes, others shifted uncomfortably, their arms crossed or hands fidgeting with lanyards. The tension was thick, but it wasn't hostile. It was the kind of silence that followed a truth people weren't ready to hear, but knew they needed to. Thomas took one small step forward, his hands open at his sides. "I'm not here to point fingers," he said softly. "This isn't about punishment or putting people on blast. It's about something much deeper than that. It's about who we are when no one's watching and who we choose to be when we think it doesn't matter." He turned to Brian, the store manager, who stood by the wall, his face serious but no longer defensive. Thomas gave him a firm nod. "Brian, starting today, we're implementing new training across every store. Mandatory training on unconscious bias, customer interaction, and what respect looks like in action. Not just in theory. I'm not assuming anyone's a bad person, but I am saying we all have blind spots. We need to confront them." Brian straightened his posture. "Understood, Mr. Reed. I'll make sure it gets done." Thomas continued, his tone measured but resolute. "We've grown fast as a company. That growth brought opportunities, but it also brought distance. And I let that distance creep in more than I should have. I won't make that mistake again." He looked out across the room. "You might see more of me from now on unannounced. I won't be coming in with a clipboard or a camera. I'll just walk through the front door like I did today. Because I need to see things the way our customers do, not from a quarterly report, but from the ground." Some employees exchanged glances. A few nodded. There was a shift in the room, not relief exactly, but maybe understanding. Thomas's voice softened. "I also know that not everything can be said out loud. Not everyone feels safe speaking up. So starting this week, we're opening an anonymous channel for feedback. That means any of you, if you see something, if you're uncomfortable, or even if you just want to suggest an improvement, you can speak without fear. And I promise you someone will be listening." A breath of air seemed to pass through the group, shoulders eased, faces unclenched. But more than that, Thomas added, "I want you to know this company isn't just mine, it's ours. You shape what it feels like to walk through those doors. You create the moments that people remember, good or bad." He turned toward Denise, who stood quietly in the back, her hands folded in front of her. Her eyes met his with steady grace. "Denise," Thomas said gently, "you were a light today. You didn't know who I was. You had no reason to treat me with extra care. But you did. And that reminded me of why I started this business in the first place." Denise offered a modest smile. "I just try to treat people the way I'd want to be treated," she said simply. Thomas nodded. "And that's exactly the kind of heart we need more of." He scanned the room once more. There were no more whispers, no eye rolls, no distractions. Just attention and maybe a bit of humility. "This meeting isn't the end," he said. "It's the beginning. From this day forward, I expect more from myself, and I expect more from all of you." He paused, not for effect, but to let the meaning land. "We're not just selling products. We're building something people can trust. Something people can feel good walking into, whether they're wearing a suit or sweatpants, whether they're young or old, black, white, or anything in between. If we lose that, we lose everything." With those final words, Thomas gave a small nod and stepped back, letting the silence speak for itself. For a few moments, no one moved. Then slowly, a hand rose. It was Denise. "Thank you for coming today, Mr. Reed," she said. "I think it meant a lot that you saw us as we really are." "I needed to," Thomas replied. "And I'll keep showing up, not just here, but everywhere. Because the work we do, the way we treat people, it matters." The meeting broke shortly after. Employees returned to their posts a little quieter, a little more thoughtful. Brian stayed behind with Thomas to go over next steps. But the energy in the store had changed. It wasn't just a corporate visit. It was a reckoning and a reset. As Thomas stepped out into the warm light of late afternoon for the second time that day, he didn't feel the weight he'd carried earlier. He felt something else. Hope. It wasn't going to be easy, but it would be worth it. And the first bricks of something better had just been laid. Thomas stepped out into the fading Texas sunlight, the late afternoon air warm against his skin. The sky had shifted to that soft amber hue that only shows up after a long day when the world begins to quiet and everything feels just a little more honest. He paused for a moment outside the storefront, the same one he'd entered that morning as a stranger to his own legacy. Now, as he looked back through the glass, he didn't see shelves or signage, he saw people. Some still working, some reflecting, all part of something that needed healing. He hadn't come here today to catch anyone in the act or to deliver punishment. He came because he cared too much not to. And in doing so, he'd uncovered a truth that was painful but necessary. Back in his car, Thomas sat for a moment before turning the key. The notebook still rested on the seat beside him, filled with scribbled thoughts and raw observations. But what he carried most wasn't on the page, it was in his chest, a sense of duty renewed. A quiet conviction that leadership isn't about titles or distance. It's about presence, about showing up when it's hard and listening when it's quiet. This company had grown from his hands, and now it was time to guide it back to its heart. Before pulling out of the lot, Thomas made one last note in his book. We don't get to choose how people see us, but we always get to choose how we see and treat others. He closed the cover gently and drove home in the fading light, not with bitterness, but with hope. There's a quiet kind of courage in treating others with dignity, especially when no one's watching. This story reminds us that respect isn't a courtesy reserved for a select few. It's a responsibility we carry in every choice, every glance, every word. Whether you're the CEO or the cashier, the way we treat one another becomes the legacy we leave behind. If this story touched something in you, if it made you think about kindness, fairness, or the power of being seen, I'd love to hear your thoughts. You're welcome to share a comment or simply take a quiet moment to reflect. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, real human and heartfelt, I'd be honored to have you join me again. Take care of yourself. And as always, treat others the way you'd want someone to treat you on your hardest day.